it's ending with the sterilization of children. So I don't think that's ultimately what the sexual revolution was about. And in fact, I think what's happened is that a lot of people that were perfectly fine with the sort of every step along the way, that train ride of the sexual revolution, a lot of people are getting off at the station that involves gender surgery for kids and all these kinds of things.
Welcome back to the Kevin Roberts Show. Look, I've been doing this show for a year and a half or so. I've enjoyed every single guest. I look forward to every episode, and thank you for making the show possible. But when I tell you I'm extremely excited about this episode, very genuinely, because I love the work of this colleague, but also because I just love this guy. He is a friend and a colleague. Dr. Jay Richards is our director of the DeVos Center for Life, Family, and Religion. He is also the William Simon Senior Research Fellow, which means that if you want something done at Heritage and you want it done in excellence and with a smile, you talk to Dr. Jay Richards. Jay, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much, Kevin. Good to be with you.
You're one of the good guys in the movement. You know that?
Okay, I wonder what that means.
Well, it's a real compliment. What it means for me is everywhere I go in the United States, traveling, which is a privilege on behalf of our work here at Heritage. Obviously, you keep a very ambitious travel schedule. Invariably, someone comes up. It might be an elected official. It might be a Heritage supporter. It might be a member of the media. And they say, do you know that Jay Richards guy? And especially considering what you work on, which is a difficult topic we'll get into today, to get those compliments unsolicited, very genuinely, you're encouraging a lot of people at a time that they think is kind of dark culturally.
You know, I'm really glad to hear that. And I get this from people who will sometimes say, thank you for being brave. And I'm thinking, okay, I get paid to do what I'm doing. And so maybe it's brave in the sense it's controversial, but I think about people like, you know, on the gender ideology front where I spend a lot of my time, people like Jamie Reed, you know, who's worked at a pediatric gender clinic for years and is very much on the left and was willing to become a whistleblower and effectively alienate her entire social network on behalf of the truth. Those are the brave people. And it's just, for me, it's a privilege to be able to hopefully provide some air cover for them.
Well, you do. And in a lot of ways, you know, for people who maybe are more familiar with the show than they are with your work or with Heritage more broadly, the work of Heritage more broadly, that's what we do. That even more than, in your case, the case of our policy colleagues doing excellent policy work, which is our bread and butter, it's providing air cover for the people who are truly brave.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's real good insight into why we do what we do, sort of how we do what we do. Ostensibly, Jay, you and I have the assignment today from the higher-ups at Heritage to talk about your book.
Oh, okay.
And it's entitled Fight the Good Fight, How an Alliance of Faith and Reason Can Win the Culture War.
Yep.
And we are, in fact, my friend, going to talk about your book. But before that, we're going to talk about Jay Richards.
Okay.
How is it that you're doing what you're doing? What's your academic background? How is it that you ended up at Heritage?
I am a shameless generalist, honestly. And I say that I think it's descriptively accurate. My background is mainly philosophy, political science, and theology. But in graduate school, I ended up narrowing in on something called analytic philosophy, which is just kind of this branch of philosophy that's about clarity and tightness of argument, effectively. And I realized it's sort of an intellectual Swiss Army knife, because if you know how to do arguments, if you know what evidence is supposed to look like and leading to conclusions, you can sort of apply that to lots of different things. And I've done that for many years, full-time at the Discovery Institute, sort of is at the intersection of, I'd say, philosophy and science or faith and science. I spent a bunch of time at the intersection, really, of ethics and economics, mainly because I found myself on Christian college campuses in the, say, late 90s, early 2000s, and realized, gosh, there are a lot of conservative Christians that still think like socialists. And so I spent a bunch of time doing that. I taught full-time in the business school at Catholic University here in DC for 7 years. And so I don't know if that's just a way to transform attention deficit disorder into a career. I won't try to self-diagnose, but I ended up at Heritage. I was friends with folks at Heritage for a long time, visiting fellow here from it'd have been 2009, 2010, teaching at Catholic U. And my friend Ryan Anderson was here as the William Simon Fellow. And he wrote this book, When Harry Became Sally, about the gender craze that was happening. And I mean, it's crazy. I actually told him, I said, maybe if you leave Heritage at some point, I'll apply for your job, and then we can double the number of backs of policy people doing it, because he was really suffering for it. His book had been banned from Amazon. Maybe only half was serious, but then I read Abigail Shrier's book in 2020, actually right before it came out, Irreversible Damage, about the gender medicine on kids, that she kind of broke that story for a general audience. And honestly, something just kind of snapped in my brain when I saw that. I thought, okay, I'm just going to be frustrated if I'm not in this somehow. And then lo and behold, Ryan was offered the presidential position at Ethics and Public Policy. I applied. Emily Gao, the director of the DeVos Center at the time, she said, "Why are you doing this?" And I told her, and I said, "I really want to be able to fight gender ideology. I want to focus on this issue. Heritage is the perfect place to do this in terms of the institutional support and its profile." And I got hired, and within a few months, weird things happened, and I ended up also the director of the DeVos Center. And so it's just honestly been a privilege, because I'm now focusing full time, not just on that, but on all that cluster of issues around family, life, marriage, religious liberty. And at the moment, the very front of that war is this fight over gender ideology.
Well, just to key in on one important part of this, and that's the great work of our mutual friend, Ryan Anderson,
Yes.
who's been on the show, and we'll have him back hopefully many times over the years. He continues to do excellent work at an organization we care very deeply
Yes.
about, the Ethics and Public Policy Center. But if I think about the work that you and Ryan are doing, that Abigail is doing, but then also very importantly, I mean, that for our audience, this is a little inside baseball, but it's good inside baseball. By that, I mean, often what I hear when I'm out traveling on behalf of Heritage is, Kevin, what are you doing personally? What is Heritage doing institutionally to cultivate the next generation of cheerful warriors
Yes.
who are policy analysts, academics, people who are going to be Hill staffers or come from the Hill or work in a state legislature? And you get to do that every day. Ryan, of course, does that as well. And so all of that to say, because in the middle of this episode here in just a few minutes, we're going to talk about some really heavy stuff. But we are bookending this episode very intentionally with hopefulness.
Yes.
That is to say, we are beginning to win on this issue. You're not going to say the following, but I can, because of the work that you, Ryan, Abigail, many of our colleagues at Heritage, also at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, have been doing. And it gives me great hopefulness that we're going to start winning on some other issues, which really is sort of the thrust of your book.
It really is. I mean, in some ways, getting sort of just down in the trenches on I'll just say the fight over gender ideology, I discovered something I had not seen before. I mean, I've been in conservative circles, social conservative circles for a long time. And I joke that for a long time it looked like the Heritage internship class is sort of, right? It's like, okay, I know these folks look basically like me, or they think very much like I do. The thing about the fight over gender ideology is it includes all the same social conservatives, but it also includes atheist evolutionary biologists and moms of no particular political persuasion that suddenly get awakened, and people that identify as lesbian or even queer. It includes kids that are struggling with gender dysphoria that have had doctors do unspeakable things to them. That's different culturally and politically from, I think, anything that's gone before. And so it's harrowing, but I think it's also hopeful, because what that means is that I think there's an opportunity for a kind of new coalition of the sane, we call in the book the coalition of alliance of faith and reason, because in some ways the public philosophy that we're fighting against has gotten so deranged that a lot of people are waking up to realities that I'll say conservatives were talking about for a long time, but no one was listening.
So that's a great lead-in to the precise motivation for the book. You have a co-author. I'll invite you to tell us about. It's very important to introduce him. But I'm really interested in if there was that proverbial moment when you said with him, we're going to write this book.
Yeah. Well, James and I, so it's a long story to connect how James Robinson and I, it is long form. We know each other because he called me after reading a 2009 book of mine called Money, Greed, and God. He really liked it and just called me up. And he is, for people that don't know him, he was a crusade evangelist, like Billy Graham in the 70s and the 80s. Then he and his wife, Betty, started a ministry called Life Outreach International that digs wells for poor villages around the world. And he has a daily TV show, Life Today, with his wife Betty. It's been going for decades. We knew who he was because we were actually donors to their water ministry. And so I said, yeah, I know who you are. He asked if I could just come down and see him. I did, and we got to know each other. And he really wanted to do a book together before the 2012 election. Believe it or not, I had actually done a project at Heritage at the time called Indivisible, bringing social and economic conservatives together. And we talked about it and said, well, it'd be good because you remember what was happening after the 2008 election. Social conservatives were told that we were spoiling the party and we needed to get out, and then Republicans could win again. I thought, well, that's wrong. And so we wrote this book together called Indivisible in 2012. And it led to this amazing partnership of this former Crusade evangelist, evangelical James Robison, and this kind of Catholic academic intellectual went on to start a website called The Stream together that's still going.
Which is excellent.
And then, we talked about doing something else. And initially we thought, well, maybe we'll just kind of update Indivisible. And then when I went and looked at it, I realized we wrote this in 2011. That's just a different universe. It's like reissuing something from 1987,
It's sort of like before time began.
It is.
It's before the Obergefell decision.
Yep.
And perhaps even more importantly than that, which is really saying something, it's the acceleration of the cultural deterioration.
That's right.
I don't mean that like in terms of conduct and comportment to fellow Americans, we're all fallen and problematic.
Yep.
I mean that more about the deterioration of institutions that would mitigate such accelerating change.
Absolutely. I think that's right. And I felt it when I read this book. So this is, remember, before the Obama Mitt Romney election. And in some ways, how sort of conventional a lot of the arguments were. And I just thought, you can't do this. We got to do something different. And so that this is what we ended up with. And it was really, when you read the book, it's forged by my experience of the last few years. I'm just convinced that there's a new alliance out there waiting to be formed of people that disagree on some fundamental things. But there are a lot of people who I'm thinking of 5 or 6 of them that I know that refer to themselves as refugees. So they don't suddenly become, conservative evangelical Christians and, all across the board, but they realize something fundamentally bad is taking place. It might be because of the woke ideology. It might be, the gender ideology. It might be critical race theory, whatever, riots in the streets. They will say, okay, this is crazy. Let's just say it's the gender ideology. This is crazy. I can see that it's crazy. All my friends don't see that it's crazy. They're wrong. Oh no. What else are they wrong about? Oh no, what else am I wrong about? Oh no, do I need to rethink God? I mean, this is how it goes. Because this issue, it's not like marginal income tax rate debates or broadband access. It's like, what is the human being? Is sex apply to human beings? Right? Does biology apply to humans? That's so fundamental. Absolutely everything hinges on that. And so it's tectonic in a way, sort of culturally and politically, that a lot of the things we debate are not. They might be important, but they're not fundamental in that way.
Yeah, and I can't think of another issue. I mean, as a historian of America, even slavery, that was that tectonic, which sounds sort of preposterous to say. Right? I mean, obviously not saying slavery was even worth having a debate over. There's one right answer, and we ultimately got that right.
We did.
But like philosophically, in terms of the evolution of Western political thought, while wrong, there was this erroneous school of thought that rationalized and justified slavery.
That's right.
We got that right ultimately. The point is, philosophically, I don't think there's been something this tectonic in the understanding of the human person, even the slavery issue in this one.
No, I think that's right, because if you think about it, of course, slavery was this universal institution of fallen human beings. And people say, why did it take Christians so long to work it out? I would say, well, even slavery was so pervasive that it took even a Christian culture hundreds of years to finally realize, okay, this is just wrong. But of course, even fallen human beings in every time and place recognize that they're males and females and that they're not interchangeable. This kind of just obvious a truth that's apparent to natural reason, even fallen natural reason. That's how far gone we are, at least an aspect of our culture, that we would deny something that is available to everyone at every time and place, whatever their religious or political or ideological perspective. That's now up for grabs, so that we could be in a weird situation where you could have a law like Title IX in 1972 that's about sex discrimination. It never occurred to anyone to define sex or female or woman, because what crazy person would contest that? Welcome to 2024.
I remember on the Title IX issue when I was president of Wyoming Catholic College, which is about the time I learned of you. I think we met very briefly at Acton or somewhere, but I was reading the stream. And anyway, I was asked often, this is about 10 years ago, why is that college rejecting federal student loans and grants? And not that I'm some, soothsayer or prognosticator, but there was something about this transgender ideology, and this is in its early days, at least as it related to my knowledge of it. But I realized in retrospect, what was gnawing at us at that institution at Wyoming Catholic was the philosophical underpinning of the most basic biological reality being questioned.
Yeah.
And, for us, it had to do with a very particular policy. The manifestation of it did. But to think we were worried about that then, which for us had to do with could we even provide multiple restrooms for men, women, and other, and just the philosophical basis of that, we rejected. But the point is the deterioration of institutions since then, the capitulation of institutions, of policymakers in this city and in state capitals who purport to be conservative. Philosophically, I just want to stay on that plane for a minute. There is no room to concede a millimeter on this.
Not at all. Not at all. I mean, that's what's so strange. Things that none of us could really have anticipated. I mean, honestly, like the debate about personal pronouns, for instance. It's not even anything. There are not centuries of reflection on that particular issue, right? Because it's so given. But in some ways, because I often try to sort of trace, okay, how do we get to gender ideology? Because it's actually kind of a complicated story philosophically, and you could trace it from Marxism to cultural Marxism. You could talk about critical theory in the Frankfurt School, French postmodernism. That's a complicated story. Or you could tell the story of the sexual revolution, which begins with the separation of sex, marriage, and childbirth. So split those things. And then, okay, you're going to have to change from institutions. You're going to have to change from laws. And let's get a technology that makes it possible to separate those things, right? And then you got to have some change in laws to prevent the thing that happens when you get a whole lot of sex outside of marriage. And people would have maybe 30 years ago said, well, the sexual revolution is about elevating sex to a sort of higher plane, or elevating the body above where it should be. And I would say, well, it's ending with the sterilization of children. So I don't think that's ultimately what the sexual revolution was about. And in fact, I think what's happened is that a lot of people that were perfectly fine with the sort of every step along the way, that train ride of the sexual revolution, a lot of people are getting off at the station that involves gender surgery for kids and all these kinds of things. And at some point, we'll have a cultural conversation about how we got here. Because gender ideology didn't drop out of nowhere. This is the result of, in some ways, all the worst ideas of the 19th and the 20th centuries distilled into a single issue.
It really is. And I would invoke both Buckley and Kirk here. Buckley to say, here's the time to stand athwart history and yell stop. And Kirk would say, it isn't that conservatives, to paraphrase him, both great friends of heritage, it isn't that conservatives are opposed to change. Yeah. We're opposed to change that's quick. Yeah. Because rarely, if ever, is that worthwhile.
That's right.
Is it right-minded? That we also, he would call this the prescription of prudence, right? That there needs to be some real prudence here as we assess this. And if all we succeed in doing, say in this calendar year, is slow this down further, to provide the time for just common sense to reign supreme, that actually will win this issue.
No, absolutely. I actually think I'm optimistic about especially the sort of pediatric medical front. So the drugs and the surgery against kids. We've got 79 of these pediatric gender clinics. We've got 600 Planned Parenthood clinics passing out cross-sex hormones and puberty blockers to kids, often on the first appointment. Those quickly have permanent changes for kids' bodies and lock them in. And so on the policy front, when we're working mostly in states and have been for the last few years, I say basically let's limit the damage, because eventually the lawyers representing detransitioners, I think, will probably sue those clinics into oblivion. That, in some ways, that's sort of the low-hanging fruit. It's the thing that it's so outrageous, I think we beat it. But we haven't gotten rid of the ideology that teaches kids they can be born in the wrong body. That's going to be the fight of a generation, I'm afraid.
So let's come back to that. But before we do that, just in the near term, tell us about a little bit of the how of the day-to-day of how you and your colleagues and your center and our colleagues in Heritage Action work on the gender ideology issue in the States.
And the first thing I should say is that this is an amazing coalition effort in which you have amazing family-friendly organizations like Family Policy Alliance and Alliance Defending Freedom and Do No Harm and Friends at the Manhattan Institute.
And they're all essential.
All working together and all playing a kind of an essential role here. And so when I'm describing what we do, everyone's involved. A lot of the work has gone into these bills that limit the damage of pediatric gender medicine. And I think probably by the summer, we will have reached about 25 of the states. So basically, we're going to get all the considerably red states will have limited these procedures. And so kids in those states will be protected. Blue states, it's a different story. A couple of them are actually magnets. So Minnesota and California actually policies to draw kids from other states to subject them to this. So this is sort of the mother of all tests of the laboratories of democracy. We're going to see it before our very eyes. And then there's an effort underway, especially this year, to try to help states protect themselves against this Title IX rule change, which is this weird kind of thing that happens here in Washington, D.C., where rules can be made and they get issued by agencies and nobody notices it until it changes the world. So Title IX, under the current administration, they want to just tweak the definition of sex to mean also to include gender identity and sexual orientation. Here's what that means, is that Title IX, under that interpretation, would protect a man who wants to compete in women's college sports, as long as he identifies as a woman. So the Department of Justice will protect his civil rights, his right to do that, to compete in women's sports, against the women against whom he's competing. So that's what it means. It's that deranged. And here's the problem, is that there never was a definition of sex anywhere. States don't generally have a definition. Title IX didn't define it. States are separating men and women in bathrooms and, in prisons, thank the Lord, and don't really have an explicit basis for it. And so states are starting to pass laws to precisely define male and female in a non-arbitrary, non-capricious way, based in solid biology, to say, look, we know what males and females are, and we have a rational basis for continuing to separate sports and spaces in prisons, so that at least they will have a basis in court for their separation of males and females. And the other side will effectively have to argue that, no, sex doesn't really apply to humans, rather this internal sense of gender. That's the real thing. And
that's the real fight.
That's the real fight. And it's this real, it's literally, does our sex bodies tell us who we are? Do they have a meaning? Or are we this disembodied, gendered self, like a gendered soul, and our bodies are just meat suits and we can just take parts off and put new parts on? So literally the question, what is the human person? What is man and woman? That's at the center of this debate.
And exemplified, there are these moments in political history where just a comment lasting a few seconds exemplifies these things. Mm-hmm. A now member of the Supreme Court,
yes,
saying, I can't define a woman. I'm not a biologist.
Yes.
What a preposterous thing. But if you're buying all of the other philosophical assumptions, as erroneous as they are, that lead you to that point, that's the only thing you can say.
It really is, because the reason that the what is a woman is such a great question is because it forces to one or the other horn of the dilemma. Either you say, well, it's an adult human female, in which you invoke biology, and then that contradicts the gender ideologues or the orthodox ones. Or you say, well, a woman is anyone who identifies as a woman, which is just really bizarre. But those are sort of the choices. If you ascribe to this weird conceptual mirrored funhouse we call gender ideology, and that's how deranged it is. Of course, the sort of irony of that answer is to say, well, I'm not a biologist, implies that she actually knew the answer and it had something to do with biology. She knew.
She knew.
Yeah.
She knew. Just to tease this out, one more level of detail, there's the ridiculousness that this even happened.
Yeah.
But then as we were chuckling about, but almost crying about Heritage, she's clearly a smart woman,
yes,
a very accomplished lady, the prep that went into that.
Absolutely.
They had to have conversations that this is how you're going to answer this question.
No, exactly. It had to be
preposterous.
No, that's right. There were people being paid a lot of money to say, okay, here's how you sort of pivot on this, because that doesn't just sort of immediately occur to you. And so this is not incidental. It's not accidental. It's the implications of the view. Now, I will say that the Achilles heel of the view is that when you state explicitly, okay, sex doesn't apply to humans. It's just sex. Doctors just impose that on you. They assign it on you. What you really are is just this thing called a gender identity that nobody's ever heard of, and there's no one won the Nobel Prize for discovering, right? That's what's really true. That's going to sound, I think that would almost sound crazy even to judges in the Ninth Circuit if it made that explicitly. And so when you're debating gender ideology, you're always debating this kind of obscure protean thing where they're not quite saying what you think they're saying. And that's what, and so it just is utterly confusing to the average person that doesn't have the time to study this stuff.
And it's true. And it reminds me when I was a first semester graduate student and some Marxist professor, nice guy, but a Marxist professor, wanted us to learn all this postmodernist theory.
Yeah.
I remember going home and mentioning to my wife, I said, I will never need to know why Michel Foucault, for example, wrote this nonsense, because clearly he was smoking crack or something.
Yeah.
Well, I see this comment by the Supreme Court justice appointee, and I'm thinking, yeah, there it is.
There it is. Absolutely.
There's the culmination of this philosophy.
No, absolutely. And it's, I won't go too deep into Foucault, but he was one of the ones that was quite explicit about the implications of what we now call queer theory, which is not a pejorative. That's the name.
It's the name.
Yeah. And queer here is essentially a verb that means to decenter and destabilize our categories. And so, of course, that's why you want to teach little kids gender ideology with the genderbread person and gender unicorn. But you want to destabilize their thinking before they get the category male and female clearly in their heads. What people don't realize, and Foucault was quite explicit about this, is that male and female, that's one category we want to destabilize. But there's other ones. There's adult child, too. And he was explicit about that. And that's frankly where this thing is going. We're already kind of there. It's just that I think we're at the trial balloon stage of the destruction of the age of consent with this stuff.
Yeah, that's exactly where we're on that precipice.
Yeah.
So I mentioned a few moments ago, Jay, that we would talk near term, but then we'd come back to the longer term fight that you said would take a generation. And that actually is, I think, a pretty good segue into a few of the details of the book, which we will eventually get into, I promise. But tell us what that generational fight looks like.
Well, the generational fight is going to be over what is man? I mean, man in terms of humanity. What is the human person? And if you think of this as a Christian, I think about the great sort of the great battles of the early centuries of Christianity, in which is the question about the status of Jesus. Is he divine or is he a creature? Is he human or also divine, or is he fully human and fully divine? Right? All these famous sort of councils in which these theological questions were answered, but what is man actually was sort of presupposed in some ways. That's actually the question of our age, because, okay, what is the human person? What unifies us? So what do all humans have in common? And then what are the fundamental distinctions between us? And in particular, the most important one is, of course, the distinction of male and female. We're not opposites, we're complements of each other. And it's that that likeness and that distinction that is the basis of civilization, the basis of the family, the cell of society. That's what marriage is the social institution that ratifies and makes public this biological fact that it takes a male and a female to mate and to have children. Everything follows from that. And so in some ways, in the, God's economy, it's left to us at this moment of a genuinely global civilization where good and bad ideas can spread around the planet at the speed of light. Now's the moment where we're going to have, I think, a generational battle and debate about the status of humanity itself.
As is always the case for you, a crystal clear explanation of really heavy concepts. So thank you for that. I know the audience will appreciate that. This is where the book fits in, because the book is a blueprint for that in many respects. And I'll read your words for you, if I may.
Sure.
First paragraph, I love. And by the way, the introduction is entitled "Open War, Whether You Would Risk It or Not." You say, you and James say, our country is in serious trouble, and not just from enemies abroad. Leaders in our government, the media, the academy, and many corporations have trashed the American project of ordered liberty. Instead, in the name of equity, sustainable development, public health, diversity, and inclusion, these powerful groups attack our history, weaponize ethnic resentments, and alienate children from their parents and even their own bodies while denying our God-given rights, reason, and reality itself. The rest of the book actually is that good. I mean that, both in terms of prose and in terms of substance, because it's a very reasonable, it's extraordinarily rational, persuasive case for not falling prey to either the philosophical errors of the radical left or what sometimes, and we feel this at Heritage, the political right is beset by, which is fratricide.
That's right. That's the dilemma, and we're noticing that right now. I mean, and you can tell even in that first paragraph, the longest sentence in the book, I think, was that first paragraph. But there's a temptation on the right. Look around at our culture, look at our political situation, and say, okay, maybe this was flawed from the beginning. Maybe the American experiment itself is a problem, and so we need to give that up entirely. And I think, and we think that, okay, that's the wrong direction. There's something worth defending and restoring in the 21st century, because that's actually what they think on the left too, right? They want to replace it. And so, but the difficulty, especially for religious conservatives who are Americans, is, okay, how do we integrate what we believe as Christians or as Jews with what we believe as Americans? How do our arguments need to relate in the public square? How should the church relate to the state? And there's just kind of a lot of stuff happening on the right now that I think, as you said, it's fratricidal. It's actually not. Okay, so there's 12 people that would like to have a Catholic confessional state, and think, for instance, that's going to be right. Maybe it's 13. 12 of them I know. Yeah. Okay, that's just not going to happen. But what that will do is kind of could create a nice little conservative Catholic cul-de-sac where you're not helping anyone. And there's a few Protestants that are talking that way for their part. This is sort of like I said. Here's the kind of principal rule if you want to succeed politically. Okay, what does the left want us to do? And then don't do that. Okay, don't do that thing. They want us creating all these little enclaves and cul-de-sacs where we're fighting amongst ourselves, and we're going to create, as opposed to conjugation, we're going to create a cool little private, base community of 1,200 people that's not going to do anything. We need to figure out, okay, how can we broaden the sort of platform widely enough that we're defending the things that need to be defended, but it's broad enough to actually make a difference in a federated republic, which is what we actually have.
Yeah, we conservatives often step into the traps that the left creates for us. In fact,
absolutely,
we do this all the time.
Yeah.
If anything, like is another inside baseball comment for people curious about Heritage goes, how we go about our work is, this is almost a daily challenge for us, certainly weekly, where over a particular proposed federal policy or state policy, we have to remind friends, and they are truly friends.
Yes.
We're not merely being polite by saying that, with whom we might have a disagreement on 10 or 20% of the issues. I mean, it's really pretty much a matter of degree.
Yeah.
That all is not lost, A, because of the difference of opinion, but B, to stop using the words that the left wants us to use.
Exactly.
Whether it's gender instead of sex,
Yep.
or in the case of the fratricide, and as you covered in your book Indivisible, the social conservative, economic conservative business, as we like to say at Heritage, we're all of the above.
No, absolutely. I mean, this idea that somehow those are separate buckets. And so we're going to talk about poverty and wealth creation, but we're going to ignore whether families exist or not, or we're going to ignore whether children are born with parents. I mean, the number one predictor of childhood poverty is whether the child has a father in his home or not. Is that economic or social? It doesn't really make any sense. And so this is sort of entirely artificial ways of sort of cashing these things out. And I think that's becoming more apparent. In 2008, I can remember some good friends saying, junk the social conservatism. These issues are not going anywhere. Well, we're here in 2024, and what are people talking about? I mean, we're talking about gender ideology and woke ideology. Immigration itself is a cultural issue. I mean, I don't know where that goes. Is that social or is that economic? I mean, all these things are at stake. And if you're sort of subtle enough in terms of your thinking, you're going to realize that all these things have relevance and implications. And we need a platform that's broad enough that brings enough people together, obviously. So I would say sort of core solid center, and then it gets a little hazy around the edges because there's going to be things in which fewer and fewer people agree on. But that's what we sort of try to do in the book is, okay, what would a platform look like for an emerging alliance of faith and reason? So in every chapter we try to argue, okay, what is kind of broadly Christian thinkers, how would you think about this as if you're a Christian like we are? And then how would you make the argument in public? Because that's not always the same thing. Sometimes those are different things, but like the argument for abortion, you can argue that theologically, you can argue it publicly without any kind of sectarian assumptions. So we wanted to sort of not only make the argument, but say, here's how you can make these arguments with your neighbors that don't necessarily agree with you on a lot of stuff.
It struck me as I was finishing the book a little earlier today that often in this show, but often in Heritage events, hopefully this is known as one of our calling cards, that we don't just diagnose a problem, nor do we just posit the solution. We actually want to give our friends, our activists on the Heritage Action side, a series of steps to take, because people want to do those one or two things that they can do uniquely. Your whole book is that. And for me, it's not just an interest that I have academically, but the sections, there's a chapter, but then you talk about this often, about the family.
Yeah.
I thought for people who would call themselves social conservatives, although we would encourage them just to call themselves conservatives, that spoke to them. And then for our friends, and this would include you and me too, who care deeply about the free market and economics, and we don't see those as mutually exclusive, quite literally the opposite.
That's right.
As informing the other. But for people who might place a higher priority on economic policy, that it was equally persuasive.
Yeah.
And so maybe walk us through that example.
Definitely.
Because there are public considerations for this, but then also inside Baseball at Heritage, we're working through as sort of our Manhattan project, what to do about the family.
No,
you're a vital part of
absolutely.
that.
Absolutely. I mean, at the moment, it's mostly wonks talking about the collapse of, I'm realizing I've spent, 14 months thinking about the decline in total fertility, which is it's a universal problem for the developed world in which countries they don't replace themselves. So our current level of sort of technological development, that the number is 2.1. So in other words, the ratio of women of childbearing age to the number of kids, if it gets below 2.1, that means that your native population, unless you have immigration, is going to go down. Now, some countries like South Korea are catastrophic, 0.8. The US maybe around 1.6. What do we do about that? What set of policies might make a difference in turning that around? And that's kind of it's a new problem, because this isn't a problem that countries had before. You go back to 1800 and we were at about 7, I think, and even 4 or 5, 100 years ago. And all of a sudden, it's not exactly obvious how to solve that. But as a policy organization, we're saying, okay, what are the kind of relevant policy levers that might actually make a difference? And then for us, we're not mere demographers, we're conservatives. We're interested about in married fertility. The example I've used with some people, I said, look, there's a difference between just being pro-natalist, or just like, what can we do to get more babies in the world, and being pro-family and the formation of the family. I said, so imagine a situation where we had a factory filled with artificial wombs tended by robots, entirely automated, that could gestate babies from the moment of fertilization until they're full term, right? So we really dropped the opportunity costs for having a baby, right? Way down. Is that what we want? Do we want baby factories? No, of course not. It's horrific, but it kind of clarifies the point that what we want is a civilization in which men and women can come together to form stable unions and to be fertile and to have children who they raise to be, as my friend Catherine Pacolic says, they're eternal souls, right? But they're also contributors, they're inventors, they're innovators. That's what we want. And we live at a time in which all of those things are unraveling.
They're unraveling in a remarkable way. But just sort of tie a bow on this, again, using the words of you and your co-author, you write, some fiscal conservatives talk up smaller government, free markets, and individual rights, but treat the family as a private matter that has no bearing on public policy. Without strong families, however, we won't have freedom and limited government for long. And then the rest of the section, very persuasively, you argue in a way that I think really attempts to unite social and economic conservatives, that we really have to tackle this issue together.
Absolutely.
Because otherwise, there are no rights.
No.
There's no society. There's no republic. There's no America. It sounds, all of that sounds fatalistic, but sort of coming full circle in this conversation on a philosophical level, it's all true. All of that follows if the deterioration of the family continues.
Absolutely. And the interesting thing about the whole debate about fertility is it also raises, again, this question, what is the human person? Because there has been a movement, mostly on the left for the last half century, to say that, well, more people means more carbon footprints, which means that we're going to destroy the planet. So there's a radical anti-natalist conviction on one side of the political spectrum, which says, actually, we don't want more people. We want, in fact, way fewer, right? Less than 1 billion people. Or are we, okay, of course, we can mess things up. We can create pollution. We're fallen. We are consumers. But we're also creators of value and wealth that was not there before. We're both of those things. And so really, I mean, your view of what is the human ends up connecting to your perspective on something like environmental stewardship and economic growth. Are humans the problem, or are they potentially, under the right kind of social conditions, the solution?
Was there some topic in the book that, when you went in and working with James on writing the chapter or the section, you anticipated one outcome in terms of what you were recommending and messaging, for example, or a policy prescription, and you ended up being surprised?
Yeah, there were a few things like this. I mean, if you just think about what I would have thought in 2009 or something, I would say probably immigration, only in the sense my views on immigration haven't changed, but I think 10 years ago, I thought of illegal immigration specifically as a problem that we needed to fix. I now think is actually existential and civilizational because of intentional policies. And so that changed. But I think in some ways just the facts have changed. And then China in particular. So I know I would, if someone had asked me, say, in 2005, okay, what's the right engagement with China? I think I would have said something like, well, China's not the Soviet Union. They're opening up these enterprise zones. I've been there. I've been to Guangzhou. I've been to Hong Kong, which hadn't been overrun yet. They seem to be doing something different. If we encourage them and engage with them and trade with them, then we'll get a big Chinese middle class. They'll put pressure on Beijing. It just totally made sense. And then at some point, I don't remember when, I realized, that seems wrong. I can't I don't remember the moment, but I know that is something that in my own view, and actually probably in heritage as a whole, has like, okay, look, that's not what happened. China is an adversary. They're more complicated. Beijing is more complicated than Moscow under the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union really kind of tried socialism directly. China, I think, is much more fascist model in which you have things that look like private industry, but are controlled either by the intelligence apparatus or by the government. And so it looks different. It tricked us, right?
Because even as we sit here, it continues to trick American CEOs.
Absolutely. And tech companies whose loyalties are transnational, I would say. This is the mother of all problems, especially because you've got, of course, the straits there. You've got Taiwan, where almost all the advanced microprocessors are made. China's dependent upon that. That's mostly American technology. It's a complicated mess. But I do think that we should, while accepting the fact that we're entangled in weird ways with China, seeing China as our primary adversary it just seems to fit the facts much better than that idea that a lot of us held in the 90s.
It's right, and it's clarifying, and as we have discussed internally here, including at a fairly recent all-staff meeting, as an institution, we had it wrong. Yeah. Not for the wrong intentions.
Right.
I mean, I wasn't at Heritage then, but I agreed with Heritage 100%. We realized the facts were different, and a huge difference in this to give our Heritage colleagues, great forgiveness on this, because we would be forgiving basically the entire American political right. Xi Jinping changed a lot of
exactly.
This, right?
That's right.
And it took his being in power years
That's right.
for us to see the full, or to the extent we think it's the full manifestation of his fascism.
Yeah.
And it's okay for those of us who are in policymaking and on the right to say, our position 15 or 20 years ago, using the best facts that we had at our disposal at the time, applying our eternal principles, that was well-intentioned then, but that's not the right policy now.
That's right.
And maybe having a little more humility in policy making, whether it's sort of in official capacity like you and I get to do, or in an informal capacity like probably most people listening to this or watching this would do. That's okay.
Absolutely. I mean, the reality is that these things are very complicated. And I focus mostly on domestic policy, in part because I understand it better. I mean, the reality is that China had different factions, right, that were vying for control, kind of like the United States, right? And there were some better guys and some worse guys. And I just think the worst guys, they seem to have won out. And it's just accepting reality as it is, which is prudence. Accept the world, find out what the world is like, and adjust your views and your actions accordingly. 2 final questions. One of them directly related to the book. So I will recommend, of course, that everyone buy this, Fight the Good Fight, and that's heartfelt. Is there one recommendation that you and James make in it that you think you really want to underscore for the audience? Unfortunately, it's not really a policy point.
Okay.
Yeah, is that we're not going to get out of this without God's help. And it's tempting to look at your current situation, and if it's really bad, just assume that, all is lost. It actually helps to take a long view. It helps for Westerners, just take the view of the last 2,000 years and the things that have changed, or for Jews and Christians to see the kind of changes religiously. We make our plans, but God is free and does things that we can't plan and maybe can't even anticipate. And so while we should do absolutely everything that we can do and that's within our power to make this country and the world a better place, we need to be praying for God to just intervene and just shake up the checker pieces on the board, please, because it's very hard to see with our finite human eyes how this works out. But for those of us that do believe in providence, we gotta make space for that and pray that it happens.
And thank you for that. And it sort of anticipates the proverbial final question on this show. So I'll give you a spin on the usual final question, which is about hopefulness, which you exude. And that is, say it's 10 years from now.
Yeah.
And so it's in the 2030s, something like what you just described, where people have been praying for divine intervention, and that has happened. That's occurred. What does America look like?
I think America is, more families are forming. More families are having children. More parents, because of interesting kind of technological developments, are able to spend more time with their children as well as be economically productive, that both of those things happen. That more people will accept that God is a public category, as the founders thought, not just sectarian. That, of course, we have sectarian beliefs that we believe on faith because our church teaches us or the Bible tells us things. But that the existence of a creator is something that can be known by reason. And in fact, the American experiment presupposes that. The idea of individual rights presupposes that. And if that could again be our public philosophy, that that's taken for granted as opposed to some kind of warmed over materialism, I think that the future will be very bright.
Dr. Jay Richards, thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
So I told you that it would be a great conversation. We've gone about an hour, which is longer than usual. We'd probably, at least I speak for myself, I'd talk to Jay another hour or two or three. So we'll have him back over the years. Remember to acquire the book, Fight the Good Fight. And obviously you can get that anywhere you would like. And hopefully what you take away from this conversation is the usual takeaway we're aiming for, which is to have hopefulness about the American future, but very importantly, the substance behind that, some specific steps that you feel empowered to take as a result of Jay's great work. In the meantime, take care. We're going to win.
The Kevin Roberts Show is brought to you by more than 500,000 members of the Heritage Foundation. The executive producer is Crystal Kate Bonham. Sound design by Lauren Evans, Mark Guiney, and Tim Kennedy. For more information and to subscribe, please visit heritage.org.